Hello and a very warm welcome to our students of MA in English. As you are aware, our MA program has a number of courses, out of which we have a course in New Literatures in English. Basically, what we've included in this course are literatures from various countries like Canada, South Asia, Australia, Africa and the Caribbean. Today our discussion will revolve around the Australian component, since it is our privilege to have with us Professor Paul Sharad from the University of Wollongong, Australia. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Sharad. Welcome, Professor Sharad. Professor Sharad is head of the Department of New Literatures in English at his university, so naturally he is the best choice for today's discussion. Now, as you all are aware, there has been, in the past few decades, there has been a significant emergence of literatures in various other countries apart from Britain and America, and there has been a growing interest in these literatures. Basically, all these literatures have emerged in countries which share a common colonial past, and therefore these literatures have been variously known as Commonwealth literatures, colonial literatures, post-colonial literatures and so on. And finally now they have come to be known as new literatures in English. So my first request to Professor Sharad will be to give us a definition of new literatures and the reasons for the emergence of these literatures.
Well, the term is a usefully neutral one, I think, that holds together a whole range of English expression. It's a way of breaking out of, if you like, the traditional canons of what we've come to accept as European, particularly British writing, to free up the idea that English literature is not literature from England, but is now literatures of many kinds in English. As such, it comes away from, as you said, the term Commonwealth, which was basically a geographical political entity. And the weakness of that was that there were countries, obviously not belonging to the Commonwealth, still writing in English, coming from the same kind of historical background that you mentioned, of particularly the legacy of colonialism. The Philippines is a good case in point. There's quite a deal of writing from there in English, and much of it addressing the same political dynamics, the same dynamics of cultural representation in texts between a powerful culture and a less powerful culture at the time, in that case the US. So there's a whole different range of histories, a different range of cultures. Many people like the term post-colonial insofar as it highlights the rationale, if you like, for putting all of these writings together. That in many cases it is a process of asserting one's own cultural identity, finding a place within teaching structures, for example, for texts that have not been accepted as worthy of study, looking at the ways in which those texts incorporate their own particular cultural differences. To write as an Australian is not just to write as an English writer, even though one may be ethnically English several generations removed. There is a cultural continuity, but as some of the early writers like Henry Lawson tried to prove, the way people speak, for example, which was mocked by the British writers at the time, was not seen as acceptable as a literary form of expression. What he was doing was asserting that this is the way we speak, it's worth writing stories that include the actual way we speak and the kind of life we lead, and that those stories may turn out to have a different shape, a different tone, different values even, than the culture they were coming from in this case. Obviously in other cases like Africa or even India, where the texts were coming from was a completely different, often cultural, even linguistic tradition, so the differences are much more pronounced. But to clear a space, for a voice to be heard that is different from received, accepted, authoritative texts, some framework has to be constructed. And newness, I suppose, creates its own problems, because America, for example, is now a relatively old literature, certainly compared to Australia. So do we keep it in or do we keep it out? Because the dynamics originally in American literature were very similar, which we can come back to, I guess. So all of these terms are provisional, all of them highlight certain things. Other terms like resistance literature or third world literature highlight different aspects of that body of writing certain things get excluded, certain things get brought into the central focus. New is, as I say, a usefully neutral way of holding this package together without being too hard and fast about any strict definition.
And I suppose it avoids any inclusion of any reference to colonialism, and I suppose it's more acceptable to nationalists who want to de-emphasize the colonial past.
There's that about it too, yes. I mean, some people argue that post-colonial as a term leaves colonialism in a central position, whereas the whole program is to get past that stage. Other people get hooked up on what the post actually means. On the one hand, people see it as post-independence, and people then say, well, the factors, the cultural factors of colonialism are still with us in many ways, in different new guises. So the post is misleading. We're not post, we're still in the middle of a whole ongoing process. Another term I like is decolonising literatures, both as an active project and a description of the kind of writing that is looked at.
Professor Sharon, basically we divide these countries as invader countries and settler countries. Like Africa and India were invader countries, and Australia and Canada are settler countries. So what are some of the similarities and differences between these two types?
Well, I guess the first thing I would have to say is that for some people there is no difference. Settler countries are also invader countries, especially if you're speaking from the position of a Native Canadian, Native American, Aboriginal Australian. But in political terms, certainly, in the relationship between, also cultural terms, in the relationship between the countries and the dominant power of the time, the British Empire, there is a clear grouping of places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, which were accepted as what were called Dominion countries and given political self-rule to a certain extent, and working out of a much more continuous relationship with what was regarded by many people as home, Britain. In the other case, obviously, you have a small group of whites holding power over a large mass of indigenous peoples who had their own perfectly viable languages and cultural expressions in many cases. So the dynamics are quite different. Relative degrees of racism, as it is reflected in literature, work across a whole range of differentials. So there's a kind of cohesion, I suppose, in the Dominion settler countries, as opposed to a similar cohesion but a totally different dynamic, if you like, within occupied countries, if you like.
Correct. And how would you say that Australian literature is different from English and American literature?
Again, it's difficult to sort of put in a hard and fast separation. As I say, in the new definition, Australia is clearly a new literature insofar as it is written and in English. That didn't start until the mid-1800s, let's say. Whereas America goes back to the 1600s in terms of the very first writing. America had universities 200 years before most people started thinking of an Australian literature. But if you look at the way people like Hawthorne and Cooper were talking about what it meant to be American as distinct from European, the things they worried about, the way they saw themselves being misrepresented by Europe, were exactly the same in many respects as the way Australians talked about the problems of starting up a new literature. For example, a chap called Frederick Sinnott wrote a very early essay about Fiction Fields of Australia, I think it was called, where he was lamenting the lack of ruins. You couldn't write a good romance without ruins. And of course, here's a brand new country, no civilization that white people could recognise as such, although it was there. What do you write about? It all looked terribly dull, flat and boring. So he turned to the bushrangers, the bandits, as that source of Walter Scott type adventure romance. And exactly the same thing was said 100 years, 200 years earlier in the States. So you get Cooper, for example, doing his frontier adventures, but inscribing a history into those adventures which was local and which was putting in its own kinds of ruins, fortresses, settlements that had been wiped out by Indian raids and so forth. So the dynamic was very similar. how to create one's own identity and how to find a space within which to express it in and through the dominant literary field.
Could we go back a bit, and could you tell us a bit about the history of how these settlements came into Australia? How,
yes, well, I guess it all started particularly with Captain Cook, 1770, with his voyages of exploration. He reported back to home base, and the east coast of Australia, which had only just been then discovered, was seen as far more inviting than the west, which had previously been discovered by the Dutch and was sandy, fairly dry, not too many rivers, so people went away and forgot about it. Following that, Britain was looking for a place, amongst other things, to dump its excess prison population.
Convicts, yes.
So they became convicts, and they were shipped out to this island country as a prison farm. They would become self-sufficient, was the plan, and eventually, as it happened, turn into free settlers and farmland and become a self-governing nation, with ensuing free migration programs as well.
What happened to the native population there?
Well, the native population, like many other native populations post-Western contact, firstly caught a whole lot of diseases that they'd never known before, had no immunity to, and died in large numbers from simple things like measles or the cold even. But there were many violent conflicts, sometimes misunderstandings, sometimes grants of land were given by the local people on an implicit understanding that would be payback of some kind, whereas the invaders, settlers, obviously didn't expect to have to pay anything back. When that was, say, people went out and speared a few sheep as recompense, this was seen as an act of hostility, so the conflict escalated. And there was also at the time the simple view, that the Darwinian view. These people were not civilised, they were very close to the missing link, barely human, and you could do anything to them with impunity, both morally and physically, because of superior weapons technology. So there were just blatant massacres, especially when sheep farming and cattle farming came in. People wanted huge tracts of land, they didn't want people on it. Some of those conflicts were very brutal.
So were these people just wiped out? Or do they still...
In many cases, yes.
Are they a few existing there also? Are they...
Well, it depends where we're talking about. Certainly across the north of Australia, there are many people, most of them still living in traditional tribal structures, many of them speaking their own languages. There are many, about 200, let's say, Aboriginal languages. Where the big urban centres are now, most of those people are no more, or are vestigially present in various racial mixes. Most of the languages have disappeared, except in names like Wollongong, which is an Aboriginal name. So there's a gradation of contact and destruction. But the other thing to stress also is we had a bicentennial celebration of first Cook and then the first fleet with Arthur Phillip in 1788. There were two responses to that from the indigenous population. One was, there was a wonderful T-shirt which said, "White Australia has a black history," which on the one hand is an assertion that there is a black history to be told, and secondly, the moral accusation that it was a dark and nasty period. But the other side of it was to simply say, this is a cause for our celebration as well, because we have survived.
Okay. And could you throw some light on the English language? Because basically in all these countries, English has been influenced by native speech, the rhythms of native speech, so to speak.
Yes, that's certainly true. It's probably not as true perhaps to the same extent as even the United States. Place names obviously have carried over Aboriginal names. Many Aboriginal names are used as a kind of decorative effect on house labels and things like this, street names. But at the same time, certain words have gone into common parlance. Obviously things like boomerang and didgeridoo and kangaroo and so forth. But even concepts like the dreaming, the traditional mythical mindset of present being coterminous, coextensive with the past. These things have entered into popular consciousness, I guess. I mean, the other mixes were the other major ethnic mixings in, particularly Irish, Scots, and even Indian words through the transmigration of colonial officers and so forth. Army terms often crept in. Hobson Jobson English is part of common old Australian slang. Quite often you'll hear somebody of my father's vintage saying, "Here, come and have a deco at this."
Yes,
that kind of thing. So the language, like English everywhere, has absorbed many elements, including some Aboriginal terms, yes.
Professor Sharad, you've been working with Indian writers also. You've done some work on Raja Rao, and I believe you're working on Amitabh Ghosh now. So could you tell us a bit about that? How did you get interested in Indian writing?
Okay. Well, I guess there's a folklore behind that. People may not know, but Australia actually imported camels at some point from India, or what was then the Raj, because of the development of what we call the outback, the dry Rajasthan-like country for pastoral farming. And the camels were very useful transport vehicles. Popular myth has it that the first two Sharads who went to India, incidentally the name's English as far as I know, brought the camels from Afghanistan. So there was a kind of predisposition to be interested in this part of the world. But the other side of it is in exploring, I suppose, our own literature, Australian literature, which was, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, still fairly new in Australia. The first formal Australian literature course was not introduced until 1958 in a university. So this was new. When I was going through high school, we did what many people here experienced as well. You study the British classics. You don't study your own writers. So this was new, it was exciting. And as an extension of that, there was a course on Commonwealth literature, as it was known then, in which there was a fairly sizable Indian segment, people like Narayan, Anand, Raja Rao, Mukherjee as well, I think.
Bharati Mukherjee.
Bharati Mukherjee. So that's what got me interested.
What would you say are the differences and commonalities between Australian writing and Indian writing in English?
Obviously, first of all, the cultural difference.
Apart from that?
There are very few Hindus in Australia, although we have a temple down the road from where I live. Again, speaking in broad stereotypes, I suppose, if you read Indian writing in English, there's a frequent emphasis on spirituality, whether it be Hindu, Muslim, whatever. Australia, by contrast, is an almost fiercely secular country. If there's a tone to things, it's an irreverent tone rather than a reverent one. So there are these starting points of difference. There are plenty of points of connection, some quite surprising ones. The first novel by an Australian-born writer was actually written in India and about Calcutta.
Which one was this?
So John Lang, who wrote a romance about the cantonment in Calcutta of the time. There was also an early set of stories called India Tales by Ethel Anderson, who married an army officer at the time. She wrote them in the 1940s, I think it was, several years before independence. But she was an Australian and went on to write Australian stories as well. Since then, many people, Christopher Koch comes to mind, went through India in the 60s before it was fashionable for Australians, and wrote a novel as a result of that. There's a good novel by Hugh Atkinson, who was a journalist, about the decolonisation of Goa, called The Pink and the Brown. So there are a number of points of contact, largely through the British Empire. We shared many governors and aide-de-camp and military type personnel. So there was an exchange going on. Many of our plants, in fact, have also been exchanged. You've got gum trees and we've got lantana and a whole lot of other things. So there was this awareness, which has probably died out since the decline of the Raj, and I think is coming back into prominence, with particularly since our government has re-emphasised Australia is now part of Asia-Pacific region, not hanging on the coattails of the British Empire anymore, and looking west.
And I suppose another similarity could be that Australia has had a Booker Prize, we've got one, as well as a Nobel Prize. We share that also.
Well, yes, there's that.
What
that
would you say
record.
about the differences? I mean, since that was a settler colony and ours wasn't, India wasn't. So what would you say are some of the differences, visible differences?
Well, I guess again, speaking in literary terms, going back to language, if you look at the famous introduction to Rajarel's Kantapura about how to adapt, a different society to English and give the sense of not just the way people speak, but the rhythm of life and the values of a lifestyle. That kind of thing is a similar dynamic, but it expresses itself in different ways because whereas you had an already viable culture and set of languages with their own literatures in place, for the whites going to a brand new country with completely unfamiliar wildlife, flora as well, the landscape became much more vital, key, as a site of investigation of how do we become part of this place and how do we find the language which expresses the kind of country we're learning to live with. If you look at Indian English, if there is a central focus, it's a much more social focus, I think, than this nature focus of Australian writing.
That's right.
This is a broad generalisation, but I think it's broadly true.
Yes, that's true. And what would you say, what genre predominates Australian writing? Is it novel, poetry, drama?
It's varied over time. Before the Second World War, certainly, probably poetry was where most of the experiment was happening and where most of the debate was in literary circles. And that was partly for the simple reason that most of the academics at the time were themselves poets. A.D. Hope and James Macaulay, two examples. But since then, particularly since about the mid-60s, the novel has taken off in just a huge way, and I don't think there's any question now. I mean, poetry hasn't stopped. There's a proliferation of that too, but the novel in the popular reading public's mind and the way it's marketed just dominates the field as I see it.
Before we go on to the novel, could you tell us what kind of poetry is written in Australia? I mean, what are the general themes? Is it again a preoccupation with landscape and?
It used to be, certainly. Then there was a kind of period of correction where people said, well, no more landscape, we've done that. Let's look at ourselves, let's look at our society. Often with a satirical view, and this happened in fiction as well. Patrick White is a good case in point. That we've looked at the landscape, the barrenness, we've looked at the rough materialism of a frontier pioneering sort of community. Now it's time to try and look to cultural values, look to some kind of spiritual value set, which is more than just conventional church going. And again, what does it mean for us here and now to be Australian and to write as Australians? What values can we look to? And just in terms of points of contact with India, very early on, the Theosophical movement was widely circulated through the world, and many of the early writers in Australia were interested in that and incorporated that into much of their poetry. So that there was this kind of consciousness of things Eastern at least, and things Indian sometimes in particular, which keeps cropping up from time to time in small ways as another way of trying to locate a cultural base which is different from what traditionally we're drawn on, and increasingly people are turning to Aboriginal culture in the same way, in a much more deep way than had been the case previously.
That's very interesting, Professor Sharad. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And I think in our next session we will go on to talking about the Australian novelists, particularly Patrick White, and the text that we have prescribed for the students, The Solid Mandala.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.